Tips with Galaxy Inc. And for this week's writing tips, we're going to be talking about trends, specifically trends in middle grade and young adult literature. Now, I want to give a little bit of history. We got two kinds of history I want to talk about, personal and then also the history of like middle grade and young adult. We talked a little bit about the history of middle grade and young adult in a previous video, which I'll link in the bottom. Up until probably the late 90s, there wasn't a lot of like this trend thing that goes on. Children's books were meant to be classics. And so authors were always trying to create these kind of classic books that would win Newberries and stuff like that. So the first thing we need to talk about is trends in middle grade and young adult. And because they are separate genres, we're definitely going to separate them out because there was this thing that happened in 1998 and really was around 1999 where a book that we've all heard of called Harry Potter came out, and it changed the face of literature in children's books. Up until that point, the trend was a little different, and this started this huge upheaval of what they call urban fantasy. Changed how big and thick middle grade books could be, because up to that point everybody thought they had to be all small. These small books like the Judy Blume books and Roald Dahl, they needed to be small books that were kind of bridger books for kids before they started reading adult books. And that was a really interesting development in children's literature. It changed the face of middle grade books, and it allowed them to be more serious. It allowed you to talk about topics that were different. Now, as time has gone on, there has been continual what I would call little moments, where there's a book that comes out and it gets a lot of upheaval, and there's a lot of books that come out that are on the same subject. So for example, in middle grade, one of the other ones was Percy Jackson, and I saw quite a few books about gods and Greek gods and Roman gods and even Norse gods. There were a whole bunch of books that came out around the same time period, right after Percy Jackson came out. Then there was the next one, which was really Diary of a Wimpy Kid, which has been out for a long time. It feels like such a new book, but it's not. It's been out for over a decade now, I think. And the thing about the Diary of a Wimpy Kid series is that it brought together kind of the graphic novel, which we know kids love. They love comics, they love graphic novels, but it also brought together reading. So now you see a huge explosion. You got Diary of a Wimpy Kid, you've got the Origami Yoda series, which has kind of the same thing going on. And then because of those, we've seen a huge explosion of graphic novels, which is really popular right now. Authors are writing them, they're being asked to write them. I know editors are kind of looking at authors and going, can you make this into a graphic novel? Those are the big things that are happening right now in middle grade. Young adults a little different. Obviously we had the Twilight series. Whether you love them or you hate them, they definitely were this huge boom in the supernatural romance. There was a huge market for them, and they just took over the section. We had to make them their own section of supernatural romance because people were in love with them. And so now there was a Hunger Games, so we got dystopian fiction, which I think is also starting to kind of dwindle away because Hunger Games and the Maze Runner series and all that came out, and kids really love them still. One of my nephews is really obsessed with the Maze Runner series, but I think we've moved on. Now, where have we gone? I'm not quite sure. I was kind of looking it up this weekend. I was trying to figure out what was the current trend in young adult, and I think we're kind of in between. I think that editors are searching for that next thing that really readers attach to. The reason why middle grade and young adult lend themselves to trends is because kids are aging out so quickly. Those books are based on what those readers want right then. And right now, supernatural fantasy is not a thing. It might be in the future. Who knows? And because that's not what the readers want right now. So the trends kind of shift and change constantly. I would say what is also not popular in young adult, unlike middle grade, is the graphic novels. It's not that graphic novels are not popular with young adults. It's that young adults can read adult literature. And there is a huge section in the bookstore, in the libraries, full of 100 years worth of comic books and graphic novels that kids can read and teens can read, and they're capable of reading them, and it's not inappropriate for them to read them. And so if there's going to be a young adult who's going to read a comic book, they're just going to shift over to young adult literature. And that's the thing to remember about young adult books, is when there comes to trends, the teens can just read an adult book and there's a huge section in sci-fi, and there's a huge section of mysteries. And so if they aren't getting what they want out of a young adult book, they can just shift over to an adult book and read those. I would say that the other big trend that is happening in both middle grade and young adult now is diversity. And that shouldn't be a trend, and I hope it's not. I hope that it is just a thing that happens. But for now, there's a big push to get diversity, and not just from authors, but also from editors and agents. They're looking for diversity within books. We don't live in a homogenous society here in the US, so we should write books that have characters that display the world around us. And I know that there are almost two separate movements now. There's We Need Diverse Books, hashtag, and then there's hashtag Own Voices. We Need Diverse Books is just asking for diversity, but Own Voices is asking for people from diverse backgrounds besides just the predominant one that has been displayed, which is a white Caucasian type of viewpoint. And looking for people with other viewpoints and other areas, and writing about their own culture and their own ethnic experiences, and really kind of inserting that and having really interesting fantasy worlds that aren't based on like a Eurocentric kind of idea. And I think that it is very overdue, and I'm glad that that's become I hate to call it a trend again, but that's what it is. It's a trend right now. I hope that it's not. I will tell you that there's some things that have never been popular, and one of them is my favorite, which is sci-fi. I love science fiction. I like books that take place on other planets and have aliens and, political struggles between planets and stuff. I just love them. But they're not very popular, and they're not popular in middle grade, and they're not popular in young adult. But I devour them, and I devour them anytime I can get a hold of one. Dystopian sci-fi kind of, scratches that itch for me, but it's not super popular. Other things that aren't as popular, again, historical fiction's not as big of a thing. Teachers use it for teaching, which if you look at my thing about historical fiction, I don't love that. But it's not as popular of a thing, and I think that agents and editors are also really looking for books that stand out, that there's not a lot about this particular subject, and that you're really delving into something that teens or kids who have these experiences will really enjoy. So that leads me into my next topic, which is writing for trends. So I want to kind of give you a timeline, okay? Let us say that you are a fast writer, and you can finish a book in a year, from inception, like writing on a napkin, all the way to the end product. You've edited it several times. Let's say it takes 1 year, and I'm being generous because some of my books have taken longer to write. 1 year to write a book. Then let's say you don't have an agent, so you need to shop your book around. That's probably going to be another 6 months. Again, we're being very generous here. Could take a year. We'll say 6 months, okay? If you already have an agent, maybe you are editing it with them. You send it off to them, they take a look at it, they send it back with a round of revisions. Depends on the kind of agent you have. Some don't do revision work. They just start sending it out. But let's say a year and a half now. All right, then they have to shop it with an editor. So now it's time to find a home for it at a publishing house. So that goes out. Let's be generous again and just say 6 months. Okay, we're at 2 years now. Then there is the production process. So once the book goes in, it has to be added to a list. It's not going to come out right away, right? It has to go into a future season. So let's say they plan it to come out. Right now it's 2019. They're going to plan for it to come out next September, not next year, the year after, 2021. So 2-year production process, which is actually fairly normal. And I say that as somebody who worked in production. So once it goes through several rounds of revision with the editor, it might take a couple of months, maybe a year. Again, it depends on how fast you're working, but it also depends on the editor as well. Then they need to find somebody to design the cover. It goes into production. It has to be printed, possibly overseas, so it takes a couple extra weeks for it to get back to the warehouse. Then it has to have a release date. All right, so that's 2 years. So altogether, we are at 4 years now. 4 years from the time you thought of your book until the book is published and on the shelf for a reader to buy. And that is a bit of a problem if you're writing for a trend. So let's say that historical fiction in middle grade becomes big again. It is a huge seller, and everybody is devouring books that have to do with the 1970s and 80s. For some reason, the kids like want to know more about this time period. You have written a book, you saw that it was a trend, you started writing. 4 years later, that book is probably not going to follow the trend anymore, because 4 years for children's literature is a huge jump, and there's probably a new trend already starting. And this is why I don't think it's a good idea to write for trends. You don't know what's going to be popular 4 years from now. And that's, again, being generous if you write quickly and everything kind of falls into place. This is for traditional publishing, obviously. We'll talk about self-publishing in a moment. The problem is that the gatekeepers, the editors, the agents, they're looking for certain things. They're trying to figure out what the next trend's going to be too. Now, here's where it works. If you write books and you've got several and you had a hard time selling one of them, how I think that you can jump on a trend bandwagon is by already having something waiting in the wings. And of course, you're not going to know. I mean, that's like trying to predict the future. You have no idea what's going to be popular in 4 or 6 or 8 years. And that is why you need to just write what you've got. And even if it doesn't follow a trend, that's okay. It's okay, because those books come out too. Not every book that is published is part of a trend. And if you're lucky enough to start getting a following or a career with books, people just read your book because it's your newest book, not because it's a new trend, if that makes any sense. Self-publishing is a little different, and here's what self-publishing and jumping on the bandwagon of trends could work or could not work. The first is that children, middle grade readers, intermediate, which is ages 8 to 12, don't have credit cards, and they don't buy books online. They just don't. So if you are self-publishing a middle grade book, you're going to have a hard time getting it to your audience, because kids go to bookstores and they go to book fairs at their schools and they go to libraries. That's where they get the majority of their books. I mean, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but that's where your audience is. And the people who have the buying power, the parents, aren't necessarily going to give their kids expensive e-readers. Or maybe they will give their kids an e-reader, but they pick out the books, which again is a problem, because then you're not writing for the middle grader, you're writing for the parents. You know, you have to attract the parents' attention and get them to buy the book for them. So that's a bit of a problem. Young adults have a little bit more buying power, but you know, they have a little bit of money coming in and stuff like that. That one's a little easier, especially since young adult books, the average age goes up to I think 30 now that people continue to read. So you know, you are actually writing for young adults, and you could possibly get your market in there. So jumping on a trend for middle grade, maybe not the smartest idea. If you're self-publishing, young adult would probably work much better. So you can join a company and work as a ghostwriter. You have to kind of build up your reputation for doing ghostwriting and ghostwriting children's books specifically, but that is something you could do. And they write for trends for sure, you know, because they're always looking at what the next thing is that kids will be interested in, and then they kind of jump on it. But you got to write fast. So that is my thing. If you're going to work for a book packager, if you're going to do ghostwriting, if you're going to do these kind of long series, you have to remember that you need to write quickly. So I think my biggest advice is don't write for trends. It's so in flux constantly. You don't know what's going to become the next book. Your book could be the next trendsetter. Your book about whatever could be the book that launches a new trend and that everybody can kind of jump on to read my book. I want them to stumble upon it at a bookstore and fall in love. And I think that that's what a lot of writers ultimately want. We want children and young adults to stumble upon our books and find them worthy of a read. And if that happens to be a really popular book, then that's great. And if it's not, then that's okay too. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to my channel. We post new writing tip videos every Friday. I've been Venus with Galaxy Ink. I hope your writing is out of this world.